Okay, I'm going to press the button. It takes about 40 seconds to get live, so. Hi, I'm Steve, Little Treasury Jewelers. I'm here with Mr. George Thomas, a noted master watchmaker who I've known for a good number of years. How are you today, George?
Pretty fine, pretty good.
Okay, well, great. I need to get a little sound check from anybody who's aboard, and see if we're coming through fine. We're both on wireless. First time we've set this up in the store this way. So waiting for a little feedback from one of you. Okay, so assuming everything's good, I have invited George here to help with a little project that we have. I have a collection of watches that have been brought in for assessment, some old pocket watches, and George, besides being an excellent watchmaker, is also an horologist who knows just about everything about watches. So George's full-time job is with Towson Watch Company, which we represent here in Maryland. And okay, sound is fine. Thank you, Dave. And hi, Carlos. Thank you for coming. And so we'll take a little look at Towson for a second and get this up. Oops. And here we go. Sorry. Okay, there we are. So this is Towson Watch Company. They have been around since about the year 2000. Is that correct, George?
Yeah, about 15 years.
15 years. And they make watches mostly themed around Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay. But some would be not so much, and just fine watches. And I'm not getting a good, slow website here. So things like this half skeleton, this beautiful piece at 11,000. And in general, George, the production of the company is what?
You mean in
the number? What are you doing per year, approximately?
We probably do between 60 and 80 watches a year,
Mm-hmm.
and everything here that you see, skeletonization and so forth, that's all done by hand. We don't do anything with computerized equipment. We farm some things out, like the cases,
Mm-hmm.
and they of course would be made by very modern methods,
Mm-hmm.
but they are made overseas, not in China, in Europe.
Right.
And they are very, very high precision.
Yep. So some beautiful pieces, very rare, and we're very proud to carry the line. I have interviewed the other partner, Hartwig Balke, several times during our watch events. So you've probably seen him with me, especially during our timeout event that we had back in October. And so this is the other half of this very nice company.
Hartwig is an engineer and a designer and a watchmaker. So much of what you see in the new watches is really by his hand.
Right. So, George, I'd like a little background on yourself, where you started out. You have a fairly remarkable story. I understand you're going to be profiled by some national TV shortly. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when, but they will call me. They already been out
Right.
to view the shop.
Okay. So I'm getting a little feedback that hard to hear. I'm going to crank up the noise a little bit and see if that is a little bit better. And don't want to get into the reverb thing. Afraid I'm doing that. Okay. There we go. So is that better, Ray? I heard Ray saying, okay, can't hear George well. Okay, so I guess you're hearing me. So George, you need to project a little bit and see how that goes. All right. So you started out where, George?
Well, I started getting interested in watches.
Well,
when
you
I was
started
about 15
Okay.
in the Czechoslovak Republic, where I was born. And from there, I just went on, became a repairman. I call it that because it didn't involve customized work like we do in restoration. And I worked for 3 years for a large jewelry store that represented, in Panama Republic, which represented some of the major lines, including Rolex, which were much simpler in those days. I'm talking almost 70 years ago.
Hmm.
And I spent 3 years working there. Then I came to the United States and went into other businesses because it was a matter of money. And in
Mhm.
those days, watchmaking wasn't a very well-paid profession. But I've always done these things. I've always had a shop. And I became interested in antique watches, and first in the beginning an antique watch was anything that was 50 years old. I was 18, pardon me, I was 21, so anything 50 years old, including my friends, were quite old. But as time went on, I went into older and older and older watches, and over the years we have done a number of significant restorations, like Abraham Lincoln's watch and George Washington's watch. The oldest watch known in existence, which is a so-called besom apple watch. It was made in 1530 and it is signed so. And it was in pretty bad shape because of people doing things to it, so-called experts. A lot of the repair was done by simply soft soldering a piece onto another piece and some fantasy. It was a horror show. All of these things we had to remove, the soft soldered brass things. This is a completely iron movement. There is no brass in it. And then we had to so we might always say reconstitute the very parts that we now have. So if we want to say naked, they were broken because we removed all that brass, which didn't make them unbroken. And we had to clean it up so that all the soft solder goes away, then weld on, and that's a trick, to weld these small pieces together.
Mhm.
Weld on a piece of iron in the rough shape of or size that we needed, and then hand shape it to the original way. We used files for that because they used files for that, and so we finished it up. There is no way that without a very close examination with a microscope, it can be determined that this part is not completely original, that perhaps half of it is original and the other one is a reconstructed piece, but it could only be told by an expert.
Now this is on display in a museum
In
today.
Baltimore, this watch that you see here is the original. It's at the Walters Gallery. The Walters Gallery, incidentally, has a fabulous collection of watches, and it's worthwhile seeing. So anybody going through Baltimore or living there, I'd strongly recommend to go and visit the museum.
Now, you made 2 reproductions of this timepiece, I believe. Is that right? Yeah.
We made 2. It is not exact. It is the reproduction of the watch, but it is noted that it is not original. We made the case. The movements in these watches that we made are totally different. They're modern. It didn't pay to reproduce the movement in the original one. It wouldn't have been much of a trick. It is a rather primitive movement. It's one of the first movements ever made 500 years ago. So for us it wouldn't have been a trick to make another one. But it wouldn't have paid, and we didn't want to, of course, imitate the original. We just wanted to show it in a larger size and then in a smaller size. This is 1.5 times the original and probably around the size of 3/4 of a tennis ball. The other one we made out of gold is again absolutely exact in appearance. Engraving, cutout, everything is done by hand, but it is the size of maybe a walnut or smaller.
Wow.
And it is made in gold. It's just, we call it the big sister, the big brother and the little sister.
Right. So, besides this piece, I understand you've made a couple of tourbillon watches yourself by hand?
In fact, I made about 4 of them, and I'm now making the 5th and the 6th one. The 6th one we're finishing with a friend. It's an interesting watch because it was started before 1885. Potter, who was a famous American watchmaker, died in 1885, so this was started roughly before 1885. It was just the frame and nothing else. So I finished the watch about 30 years ago, and I didn't quite finish it. I meant to make a tourbillon watch out of it.
Oh, got a little problem there.
I meant to make a tourbillon watch out of it, and so I did do the whole thing, restructured the original Eboche or rough movement. And then I decided that, that was about 30 years ago, and now when I wanted to finish it, I decided that it's just, at this point in life, it's just more than I want to do totally by hand, so I am finishing it with a friend who is also a fabulous watchmaker, also an engineer. He's local. In Pennsylvania, just over the line. And he is skilled in the computer-operated equipment. So we're actually going to finish it on computer-activated equipment, and even that will take us close to a year.
My goodness.
But it's a very complex watch. It's a minute repeating stopwatch, meaning that it strikes every minute, every hour, the quarter hour, and the minutes after the quarter. And then, of course, it's also a stopwatch if you want to take it to the horse races.
Okay. So let's sort of focus on what we brought you over here for. And this is part of a collection that we were asked to assess, and we're going to look at a couple of watches and get George's opinion of what what we have in front of us. This is something we, Little Treasury, occasionally gets asked to do. It's definitely not our wheelhouse, but we do have our good friend George, who is one of the world's experts on horology in general, and especially some vintage pocket watches. George, what am I looking at right here?
This is a interesting watch because it is the first and original, you might say, Timex type watch. It was made before 1900. It was made actually until about 1920 or 30.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the cheap watch of the time, but just as Timex, it is very accurate,
Mm-hmm.
and it lasts a long time, and people bought it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
a pocket watch because that's what was in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And this one surprisingly even runs good, even though as old as it is. Technically speaking, the escapement is different. It has a pin escapement rather than a jeweled lever, pin lever. And there's some other things. They tried to make it as cheap as they could, and they did, and they run very good if they're
And
good.
interestingly, has glass over the movement, which I think is
Right.
pretty rare. We don't see that very often when there's a case back.
Right.
So, okay. Timex of the day.
The Timex of the day.
System Roskopf.
Roskopf, yes.
And that is made in Switzerland? Yes, okay.
Roskopf was the fellow who invented it.
Okay. And another interesting feature, this is a push-button mechanism for setting the watch. You have to push the button, and it allows the time setting to engage. So, all right, I will put that one aside, and let's take a look at another piece. So, what have we here? Let's get this focused in. This is a Tiffany piece.
It's an interesting watch. It's interesting because of what it is, but it is a watch that in the early 1900s it was frequently done. It's actually a Longines watch, and the movement is signed Longines. But the dial is signed Tiffany because this model by Longines was made exclusively for Tiffany. So Tiffany was the agent for Longines. They put their name on it, but in actuality it's Tiffany. And it is very high grade quality. Tiffany never sold anything that wouldn't be of the highest grade as far as quality goes. And it runs fine. And this is back to the 20s or the 30s.
Mm-hmm. Very pretty, actually.
Yeah, runs like a top.
Yes. Okay. So let's take another look. This is missing its hands, and it will get focused in a sec. There we go. And what have we here?
It's a part is missing. The hour is missing, and the minute hand is missing. It is key wind and key set. This watch goes back to the early 1800s, perhaps the late 1700s. Is interesting because it is also in good condition. Those few scratches are negligible on the dial if you consider that it's 150 years old or more, and it's what is called a you don't see the movement. No,
Yeah,
here
right.
on the bottom.
Huh?
On the bottom, right there where you were.
Yeah.
Right there.
Press that. There we go.
It also is in running order, which is interesting, and it's what's called a Verge movement. It's a Verge escapement. This is no longer made. It was the original movement they were able to use for pocket watches because it doesn't need a pendulum. and it has a hairspring which was invented in 1675. And the Verge type of movement has been, we have some written evidence that a clock was built in a church tower in around 1200, and it had a pendulum, but it did have a verge escapement, so that's where the origins of the verge escapement, I suppose, come from. And it was only a matter of making them suitable for pocket watches, and that happened around 1530 when the watch was made, which you saw before, the one that is at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore.
Very interesting. Also, note the decoration on the edge here. Whoops, just got it out of
In those
focus.
days, everything was handmade, and
Yeah.
if you look at the cock of the watch, if you show the top flat, no,
Yeah.
the other side.
Over here?
If you see that decorated cock which holds the balance,
Mm-hmm.
that's done by hand, and it usually was done by women. Because we have a record which goes to 17 something, I forgot now, where all these women went on strike because they got much less than men, and not very much for this at all, and they said, we are doing good work, we want more money.
Well, not much has changed. All right, thank you on that one. Interesting piece. So this could be restored with
No problem at all.
with the proper hands.
Oh yeah, we
Yeah.
restored these from scratch.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I've been to George's workshop, his personal workshop, and it is full of watch parts and the most exquisite lathes and other devices for watchmaking and restoration. So he probably has the hands down there at that workshop already.
Every day.
Yeah. So
Incidentally, some of the equipment that my partner has in his shop and I have in mine is no longer available at all. Much of it we have sort of found, much of it is quite old. I have one piece of equipment that's 200 years old. We use it anytime.
really, okay, interesting. All right, let's look at this piece. When it pops in focus, what do we have here?
It's an Elgin watch of the 20s, sometimes before or later. It could go into the 30s. At the time, this was a very small movement, made in Switzerland but marked Elgin. Le Coultre now makes a smaller movement, also rectangular, as you see, but probably half the size of this. It's just a marvel of engineering.
Well,
It's the Le Coultre Model 101, and if you have a chance to read about it and see it, you should. It's a marvel of engineering.
yeah. Sorry about the focus. It goes in and
You
out.
see it.
I'm going to let George open this case. We'll take a look at that little movement. So I'm hearing a bunch of these things ticking away. So they're not dead in the water by any means. And I hope the sound is still working.
It's not always the easiest thing to open these, but we will.
Uh-huh. Well. George is working away, and we had it ready to go when I popped it shut on him, so my bad. There we go. All right. Whoops. So here's this
That's
tiny movement. To me, obviously, Art Deco motif on the dial. Would that be correct, George?
yeah, yeah.
And sorry if I get out of the focusing
Yeah,
zone. It's popping in and out on me. There we go.
It's really a very precise movement, and it's a high-grade movement. And if you just imagine from this that Lecoultre makes a movement that's about 1/3 of the size, approximately, maybe even a little less. These people are engineers and watchmakers beyond comprehension of anyone who is not in the business. And this is a very nice movement for the day, and it ran very accurately, and we can restore it to where it's going to run to the second.
Very nice. Okay, we'll give that back to George, and we got another piece here to show. And what have we with this one, George?
That watch is before 1800. It is extremely interesting because it is one of the few watches that I have seen in all these 70 years that I have been around them that is that old and is totally original, including the crystal. It's just marvelous. Usually we see them with replacement crystals for sure, and quite a bit damaged, sometimes total wrecks, because people don't know how to handle them. Today's watchmakers are not doing this type of work, and so this is really what we do in our shop, in my shop, my partner's shops. That is where we do the new watches, the Towson Watch Company. He does mostly. I can open this for you if you want
I
to.
think it will open
See,
readily.
it's called a pair case watch because it has two cases. The inner case holds the movement, and the outer case protects the inner case and also covers the keyhole.
Yeah, what's the writing in there, George?
There are two papers, one on top of the other. In the old times, let's say in the 1800s and before, watchmakers who did some work on it put their advertising paper in there. And this is an advertising by an English watchmaker who just did some work on it. And fortunately, he must have been pretty good because this watch is not damaged at all. This was handled by an expert in the past. And so I can open it and I can show it to you. And
Okay.
you can see on the back here,
Wow.
it looks totally different than today's watch, and it is. It couldn't, mechanically speaking, even be compared to a modern watch. The system is different, the layout is different, a lot of things different. It's called a Verge Movement. It's a different
VERGE, George?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Verge.
For what?
For the system which makes it tick.
Okay,
It's
but is
a
it a watchmaker's name or?
No, that's the technical name for the type of movement.
Right.
And if you look at the so-called cock, it is an English cock, but I suspect the movement may have been made in Switzerland. That sometimes is the case. That decorated cock that cut out, that is all handmade, and it was done by women. and they weren't paid anything for it. So in the mid-1800s, when these cocks were not used anymore, but there were other things decorated like this, women went on strike and said, we do better work than men and we get less money, and that's the end of it. So I don't know what happened, but hopefully they do get more money.
Right.
So
Okay.
you can, all of these parts, that's all made by different craftsmen by hand.
Very interesting. All right, I'm going to give this one back to you to reassemble and keep intact, in good shape. There
And
we are. So I have one more piece that we can talk about, and sort of interesting. This is a crossed rifles or muskets, and inscribed in Russian. And let me open up the front if I can. Yep. And it looks like we have a picture of Tsar Nicholas, so that would definitely date it before World War I. And in fact, it's dated 1910. And I've had a little help with the Russian. Maybe some of you out there are Russian readers, but I'm told it's a prize for a marksman. Military soldiers won this watch for winning some kind of a shooting contest. So anything special about this watch, about the movement?
it's a silver watch, which is a little surprising because the Tsar usually was a big spender, and I thought maybe he would have done it in gold. But nevertheless, it's very nice. The case, well, it could have been Russian made, but it has Swiss hallmarks in it, so I think the case, like the movement, is Swiss made. It was imported to Russia. The Swiss sold a lot of watches at that time to Russia. There was no watch industry in Russia then, it was all imported. And it was then inscribed there, and it's a nice, very nice piece because it's in very good condition, and it's Russian in a sense, just a few years before the Tsar lost it all.
Very interesting. Okay. So that's all of our show and tell that I have at hand, and very informative. So I think everybody should has a sense that George's knowledge of watches is boundless. And when we have events in the store, and we have George here with Hartwig, the people who come just really love to get all this deep background. So
we like the store here. It's very elegant, and from time to time there is an event in the store where people are coming, mostly invited customers and the public too, and they're all very enthusiastic, and we talk to them about watches in general, and our watches and our company, and the customers really like that personal contact with the store's customers.
yep, and we love having you. So that is a lot of the content. So tell us a bit more about your journey in life. I'm just a little bit curious. I know that you're going to be doing this big interview.
Well,
how did you end up leaving Czechoslovakia? And
ended up in
what-
a scam, which, if it had been discovered by the communists, a friend, this was a curious scam. a friend helped me using a fake military uniform. If they had caught us at it, they would have shot us on the spot.
This is when you were leaving?
It was 1948.
1948, right.
And they didn't catch us. A very brazen approach. If you want to know the detail, it sounds funny now, but it wasn't then. The Jewish community was making, collecting Jewish kids, small kids, let's say up to 15, that survived, and different countries, the Jewish communities in different countries were wanting these children to be adopted there, and the communists were glad to get rid of them because they would have had to pay to educate them and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And the communists were in fact anti-Semites, not much different from their predecessor, famous predecessor. And so what she did is she filled out all these papers for the kids. There was a paper and it had to be stamped and signed by one of the top communists there who was in charge of this operation. And so what she did, and she noted that he just flipped it over and just signed it and never looked. So she put in a blank. And he never looked, this friend of my mother, as she anticipated, and now we had a signed and stamped blank, so we filled it out over the signature, and we were home free, except that this was for a transport of a Jewish kid, a small Jewish kid that was going to be adopted, and here I was an adult person.
Wow.
But we figured that they're not going to notice it, and it was pretty much a risk, but we took it and it worked, except that I had to have now a release from the military, because I was 18 years old. And I had had polio, but it was very, very insignificant at that time. And so I went to the military, and there sits this top communist who was most likely a street cleaner before, but the communists always took the garbage from the bottom and made them leaders and people who make decisions. That's why it collapsed. And I went there, and the son of a gun says, I'm not going to give you any release. You can work in an office. You can work as a translator. We need people like you, because I spoke a couple of languages, 3 at the time. And I was done. So I left. What now? Well, the lady who slipped that paper in had a boyfriend at that time. He was maybe 45. And he was an army officer, but the communists threw him out because he was not reliable, they said. But he kept his uniform. And the uniform at that point was obsolete already because they issued new uniforms. He was so brazen, that fella. He put on the uniform and he said, let's go. We went up there by train to this town where I had to be, where was that office. And he just walked in, and I walked right in next to him. And he says, this is a friend's son. And he was here, he needed this signature, could you do it? He says, no way I am going to do it. He is going to be here and serve his 2 years. And the guy, my friend in his uniform, looked him straight. He put himself face to face with this guy, and he yelled at him, the equivalent of, you son of a bitch, when you talk to a superior office, you stand at attention and you salute. And the guy got a little blue in his face, jumped up and stood at salute, and he told him very quietly, now, sign it. And the guy says, well, we can make an exception.
Right.
He sat down, signed the paper, handed it to him, and stood again at attention and saluted when we turned out, and we walked out real calm. He whispered to me, quiet, quiet, get out quietly. And once we had the door shut behind ourselves, I guess he sat down then. He said, let's get the hell out of here before they catch us, because they would have probably shot him for sure for faking a uniformed officer, and maybe sent me to concentration or shot me too, who knows. Anyway, we ran to the train station, jumped on the train, no matter where it went, we said. But luckily the train went back to Prague. So we bought a ticket and rode back to Prague. I went to the passport office and they issued it, and they never do anything.
Wow.
So that's the way we got out. And then a friend offered, a friend who was German, but his brother-in-law had some kind of a business in the Czech Republic. Of course, the communists took it, but he was still there. And he was Austrian, so he had no problems with the communists. They went visiting, and we're going to do some business, and they realized that it's foolish with the communists. So he went back to Panama to his old job in a jewelry store. And he said to me, if you can get out, come to Panama, and watchmakers are hard to find. You can get a job the same day where I work. Okay, so, you know, I really didn't know much. I knew how to clean a pocket watch, but these little ladies' watches, I never even saw them.
Wow.
So I went to work, and there was a Spanish watchmaker who was a good watch servicer. He couldn't make any parts, except two stems and staffs, because you had to make, but they didn't look too good when he made them. So he was a nice guy. He came up to the desk, gave me a lady's watch, and I don't know which way to look. And he says to me, you know what? You're not much of a watchmaker. I'll just show you once. So look fast, because I'm not going to show you again. Okay. I went to his desk. He took the watch apart, handed me the pieces, and said, now go back and put it back together, and I did. So I looked very fast for a long time in life, and within 6 months I was better than he and the other guy who was there put together, because when I made a stem and a staff, they looked like from the factory.
So, any formal watch school in this process, or
the 3 years that I worked
job?
in the 3 years that I worked in Panama, I really became very good, better than the two of them.
So it's on-the-job training, essentially.
Yeah,
You're learning.
and then I was there for a year, and the boss realized that these two are not that efficient and that I'm better than one together. So when he opened the second store, I was 19 years old, but I spoke Spanish and English at that time, as well as Czech and German. I can pick up any language if I'm there for 6 weeks enough. I have the talent, I don't know how, and I can talk. So when he opened the new store in the new Hilton Hotel that was in the new part of town, he sent me there to run the show, the store, and as well as I had a desk there, and in between, when I had time, I just cleaned watches, you know. But it was very helpful. It was a lot of experience, you know. I was 19 years old, and he throws it in my lap and says, go ahead, do it.
Good.
So I did it.
Yeah. So what do you think of the current crop of watchmakers? Do you have any interactions with the young people coming out of school, and what's your opinion?
There are two kinds. There are two very good schools. The Rolex School in Lancaster, they come out trained like you won't believe it. But watchmaking is different today. You don't make anything. You pick up your telephone if you don't have a part, punch a few buttons there, and my friend does it that way, and he'll say, well, it'll be here tomorrow.
Right.
In my days, you had to go to Western Union, or you had to phone, and that was very expensive. So you usually went to Western Union, you needed a part, it came back in 2 weeks. So it was totally different. But the people who come out of the two schools, which is Rolex and then the Watchmakers Association, Watch Collectors Association, are very good, but each one is for different purpose. Rolex trains watchmakers to be watchmakers today and to be exceedingly exceptional because they hope to employ them themselves.
Right.
To do a Rolex is not that simple. Our association is more a clock training because you simply can't train to do a watch in 6 weeks. So it's more clockmaking, and it's more for people who want to be hobbyists. The problem is that a lot of people who take that school, and some who take the Rolex school, they just walk out and get a job elsewhere, and they say they're a watchmaker. Well, they're 100 miles from being a watchmaker. And then the disasters come through, you know, particularly if it's watches like you have shown on the screen here. And then they drift to us, and we charge a lot of money to private customers because this sometimes takes days to bring it back.
Got it.
So it's a split picture there. My partner took that course, but he's a totally interested person. And he's an engineer, and he's a designer, so he has a background. He understands the mechanics. And so he learned what he did, he went at it, and worked himself right into being a perfect, skilled watchmaker.
Very interesting for both of you. So let's just, we need to start winding it up. I promised George that I would get him out of here before we get our intense traffic period. That's why we're on early today. But let's just take a quick look at this timepiece from Towson Watch Company. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this. What is this model, and
this
what's
is
special?
one of our more complex models. It is reasonably expensive, and it is a typical example of my partner's work. The design and the execution is all his work. He's very good at designing and coming up with ideas, and this watch is quite different. The dial, for instance, that's his design, but it's made in Germany by a leading engraver, and you see the center of it, that's called perlage. That's handwork. And that engraver is the premier perlage person as well as engraver. And we've been friends with him for years, so he does our work.
That is a silver dial, I believe.
Yes,
And
all of our higher grade watches, not all of them, but many of them have silver dials.
And that the white part is oxidation, and it's removed from the rest of it that remains shiny. Is that correct?
It is first engraved, and then there is a heat process, which gives it that silvery shadow. And then, I haven't actually seen it, but I read about it. I haven't done it. It is treated in acid, which gives it that color. And then it is cleaned, and then the subdials are put in, and the main dial is, the centers of the subdials are also done when the center of the dial is done, because it's the same type. And then it's cleaned and prepared, and then the same engraver puts the outside on that you can see. He finishes the dial other than the printing.
Right.
And that goes then to a printer who specializes in these different types of dials.
Right. And so something that's very interesting and I like very much about the watch is the second hand, and you can see the forks on either end. It's sort of like the little devil's fork.
Right.
And even on the point of it, that's a fork, right?
We
An
had a
open end.
regular hand on it,
Yeah.
and my partner kept looking at it, and he says, you know, this is not a regular watch.
Yeah.
We want a different second hand.
Mhm.
So he came up with this idea and put it on, did it.
And that's pretty much handmade, isn't it?
Well, yeah, there is some. What he did is he took another hand of a different design and converted it
Right.
to his design. And in the end, it looks pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very
And
nice.
Carlos from Panama, interestingly, says, I can see a Breguet heritage on that watch.
Oh, that
So
would
perhaps
be
so,
nice.
huh? Yeah,
Yeah, an original Breguet.
yeah.
We
Okay.
made a replica of a Breguet, but it can't be told it is a replica unless it's an expert.
Right. Okay, so
Very nice.
beautiful piece. We've sold
Yeah.
a number of these. This is number 5, so this is
Right.
one of the early.
And
There aren't many of any of them out there. So.
actually, I don't know. I think he said he plans 5 or 10 of these, and it's a lot of work.
Yep, it sure is. So,
That's his department.
yeah, well, hats off to both of you. You worked very hard and having established this company, and you have a good following, especially in our area. And wonderful to have you on. So I'm going to start winding this up. If there are any last comments, I'm also going to put you over to a little PR for what's going on. We are launching a sale starting tomorrow through the end of the month for the benefit of the Make-A-Wish Foundation that provides realizes wishes that critically ill children make. It's a fabulous outfit, and we're going to be donating a portion of our profits from now to the end of the month to that foundation. So most of you I know are out of the area, the people who follow this. Happy to take some phone calls. We're not going to be publishing a list online, but certainly in watches, we have, I think, about 150 watches included, and they'll be anywhere from 20 to 50% off. So give us a shot. Don't expect the rare Grand Seiko, this or that, to be on the list, but a lot of desirable pieces are, and help us make a nice contribution to the Make-A-Wish people. So that is what's going on. So we are going to wind it up, and thank you, Carlos, for the nice comment. And let's, it's going to take a minute to get back in touch with my little whizzer. Okay, here we go. I'm going to cut it off now. Thank you, everybody.